Thank you very much. Thanks so much for coming today. Yes, solving global challenges together towards a global approach of peace, dialogue, and capacity building. Lofty subject, indeed. We've got a panel here with a lot of experts from a lot of different backgrounds. People from different places, solving different problems, but unified in their effort to attack these complicated and related issues. And so I'll introduce them now. So Anna-Katharina Hornage is the director of the German Institute of Development and Sustainability. She's also professor of sustainable development at the University of Bonn. Ronnie Chan is chairman of Hong Leung Properties. He's an active member of a number of other efforts, including the Better Hong Kong Foundation and the China Heritage Fund. Luciana Servo, president of the Instituto de Pesquisa Económica Aplicada, which I'm not sure I nailed, but whose research informs the government of Brazil's public policies and development programs, and Andrea Schall, who is the director of global relations and cooperation at the OECD, a sort of ambassador to the G20, G7, and a great many other nations. So yes, you're all involved in appraising highly complicated issues and proposing policy solutions and designing them. So I'd like to ask each of you, just sort of briefly as we begin the conversation, what do you see as the sort of most pressing global issue now? And maybe I'll start with you.
Well, we've been thinking in Brazil for until the last 4 years that we are going a scale of growth and also inclusive growth, and also thinking development as an environmental issue. But the last 4 years show that we have a lot of challenges, and these challenges were disruptive in Brazil. So we have to rethink the way we do policy in Brazil, and also not think nationally only, but also globally. So from IPEA, and when Brazil assumed the G20 presidency, I will be the lead chair in Brazil for this task. And we are getting together Brazilian institutions to think about global solutions for our problems. We have a lot of problems. We have problems of inclusion. We have environmental problems. We also face a lot of challenges during the pandemics in the health sector. So we are now thinking how you do different, not incrementally, how Mrs. Noah said, we cannot do incrementally, and think about this issue and bring them to a new form of doing public policies. And for this, we should, for sure, engage in a global debate. So for IPEA, it's fundamental to be here, to be debating these global solutions with all the T20 task force.
Thank you for that. And Anna-Katharina, what would you say is the sort of the main issue that occupies you at the moment and kind of that requires global attention to solve?
Yeah, thanks for having me. And if you look at the issues at hand here also for today and the coming days, I think the ongoing disruption of global trust is probably the biggest challenge that we have at the moment. And since a number of years already, we observe social polarization processes since many years across the globe and across actually all types of countries in terms of income groups of countries that go hand in hand with political autocratization processes in some countries. But now we have also the situation of Russia's war in the Ukraine and global reactions to it. And I think if you look at the elections on the level of the General Assembly of the United Nations, we know that there is a substantial need for dialogue and for discussing our differences, and then, of course, turning towards where we converge.
Mr. Chan.
Well, coming from where I am, I live in Hong Kong, which is now part of China. That which looms high above everything else is really the conflict between the United States and China. When the number one economy want to pick on the number two, it won't end well. Dennis Noah said this morning that decoupling will change everything. And sure enough, we are seeing that happening in front of our face. In 4 areas at least. Number 1, academic exchange is now being curbed. Number 2, certain products, in particular sensitive products, are also being curbed. And number 3, people's exchange, we're now sensing that, even experiencing a little bit of that. And then finally, capital exchange. Capital flow is also being disrupted. I know that there are many other very critical issues in the world, such as sustainability, something that occupies my mind a lot. But that said, in face of a geopolitical threat, let's hope that it doesn't get to a kinetic war situation, but nonetheless, the threat of it is so serious that it is just changing everything in our calculation as a business person, as an investor, and as policymakers and decision makers.
And Andreas, you sort of speak to almost everybody, so I'd be curious to see your perspective.
Yeah, thanks so much, Oliver. Pleasure to be with you. And I have to say, I mean, there are probably three avenues or three things which causes these wrinkles under my eyes and which cause sleepless nights currently. First of all is, I mean, one of the wrinkles is painted with the Ukrainian flag, and it's the economic situation we are facing. We see some light at the end of the tunnel with 3% economic growth. At the same time, we have a minus 2% in global trade. We have headline inflation coming down a bit, but still people are feeling the economic consequences of this war, of the post-COVID still, which came on top of the post-COVID recession. So we kind of, and this goes to the question of trust. We need to kind of also give people a perspective in their skills, in their education. We need to make sure that they can pay their bills in heating, in food. Food security is a big issue. So the economic situation would be one. The second one would be, I think we need to have a more efficient, more economically orientated way to deal with climate change. We made some proposals, maybe we can discuss later. And the third one, I think this year is really the question also and here I'm with my Brazilian colleague, we need to kind of have a new model how we discuss financing of the SDGs. We fall 4 billion short after the pandemic now, and this year can be really the year of SDG and climate financing with the upcoming summit of Macron in France, G20 Leaders Summit in Delhi, and then the SDG Summit, which was, as I heard, discussed earlier. So a lot of wrinkles, right, but a lot of opportunities, a lot of smile in order to attack the challenge.
Well, let's pick up on one of those wrinkles, the war in Ukraine. And Anna Katerina, to you, what do you think that the sort of ambivalence that we've seen from a lot of nations around their view of it, what does that tell us about perhaps the failures of a kind of Western-led order to try to get everyone on board and kind of, or what can we learn from it if that's perhaps too strong a way of formulating it?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at the numbers, we have to be very careful because and look a bit more in detail because, of course, the reasons for abstaining, for instance, from the vote or not attending the votes differ substantially, is my impression, at least from talking to the partners. But what we can observe is that we have a situation where, at least in the European and German context, I would also say in wider contexts, we have a strong defense-oriented analysis of the situation. You also just mirrored that in many ways. And at the same time, I wouldn't agree to hierarchize security, defense, and sustainability, but rather would argue, well, if it's about security, safety, certainty, long-term, mid to long-term, then it's clear that cooperation has to stand at the center. And defense-oriented strategies come in where the cooperation then fails. That is at the heart of the Agenda 2030, and I'm very happy and glad that we also within the Think 7 context and in close dialogue with our colleagues from Think 20 placed again an emphasis on reigniting the Agenda 2030, but also already building the necessary bases for post-2030 discussions, which is, there's still some time, and it's about Agenda 2030 acceleration, implementation. But at the same time, it's also clear that we need to invest into geopolitical corporations, to put it that way, in order to assure we have a basis for coming together.
And Ronnie, so just sort of on this question of how do you think we can make progress on a lot of these issues, these global issues, when you have a time when you have sort of the biggest players not able to sort of cooperate? Obviously, this is going to be a major problem. Is there a way around that to still force some of these things through, or do you think it's really very important to resolve these issues at the national level first?
First, allow me to comment one word on what Anna Katerina has just said. You were very careful in your using of words. You mentioned if the security and defense threat is long-term and medium-term. I wish it were. Yeah. It is of the immediate term for some of us. And as a result, it's not that sustainability will go out of the window. You walk and chew gum at the same time. But that said, I think the situation there is really quite serious. As far as your issue, Oliver, I'm a small guy. When I'm a small guy like me, you don't count. I'm serious. Ever since I grew up, I know that I don't count in many occasions. And so you have to be careful to keep yourself alive. And as you indicated, when the two biggest players in the world want to, in one way or another, decouple or even couple, engage, except in the wrong way, such as military, security, defense, and so forth, then that's really a serious situation. I think that what the smaller guys, if they can somehow collectively do something, and the key word is collectively. How do you get them to collectively say something? And Katerina, you were also very careful. How do you look at the numbers? 85% of the people in the world did not condemn, but they did not sanction some of the things. And so you do have some collectivity here. And does it not send a message? And if you are part of the 15%, ought you not also be humble a little bit, like small guys like me are forced to, and perhaps look at the situation in a slightly different way?
And do you think that just to bring the question to you, do you think that there is this ambivalence on the subject of Ukraine, do you think that it is in part due to the fact that there has not been a sort of collective view in the kind of Western-led order? Do you think that there has been a shortcoming there, or do you think that,
I think what's happening is something like what we see during the pandemics. I work for 20 years in the health sector, and we cannot be unaware of the pandemic that was coming, and all the social determinants, all of the things. So these conflicts are part of not acting when you know that the conflict is growing up. Like the pandemics, I think we have to rebuild multilateralism to think globally and think on the G7 and also in the G20 and how to grow the collective bargaining, to think collectively. You think only bilateral, you think only in the ways that you do commercial agreement. This will bring pandemics, wars, and conflicts that cannot be solved collectively.
But so, and if we take the pandemic, because that's a good example of a truly collective problem that the entire world sort of experienced simultaneously in quite a personal way, much more than many kind of more abstract issues like financial crisis, let's say, and your expertise being in healthcare. Do you think that what do we come away from that concretely, and what do we learn about how to deal with these kinds of problems, and how can we apply that to other issues, other global issues?
I think the most important thing that we knew and about these pandemics is we think only about international countries, not about globally. There will be spillovers. So we try to take the pandemics in the national view, and when you see this is spread all over the globe. And in Brazil, for example, also the national view, not cooperating with all the countries, and this brings a lot of challenge. Besides that, in the health sector, we know that we cannot think only in health as a sector. We have to think in all the determinants of health. So the economic market way of thinking, the economic way of thinking and exploring the territory, not thinking in the urban system and not thinking in the health system and the educational system, as an integrated part of our society, brings us through the pandemics. This is all a disaster that was built by this way of exploring the natural resources, exploring the other resources. We're not thinking about how it will be in the future. If we not change this view, do a mindset change, as Mrs. Noor was saying, we will face another pandemic soon. So.
And I'll put the question to you, Andreas, also, who interfaces with a lot of these countries and a lot of them developing nations about kind of what do we learn from the pandemic and how to address those global crises. And what do you hear also from them about what is required from these multilateral institutions more broadly?
When the crisis, if the COVID crisis, if had anything positive, it showed us the need for international cooperation. And here I'm with Anna Katerina and also with Luciana. So really the opportunity to cooperate and to find joint solution, to agree on systems for track and trace, to agree on vaccinations, to really also discuss things like intellectual property rights on vaccinations, to come to a new balance between North and South. So there are a number of lessons to be learned from the pandemic. And Indonesia, during its G20 presidency, did fantastic last year in order to kind of make it precisely this dialogue, create an additional fund at the World Bank for pandemic preparedness. So this is something where I think we really learned. And I mean, this is also something we can take for the current situation. I mean, if you ask G20 leaders in Bali, for example, 95% of the people in the room would say that a just peace in Ukraine is good for the world economy. And Prime Minister Modi said, this should not be an era of war. So everybody thinks that we should act together on some of the things. The question is just the way. But even in the war situation in Ukraine, there are positive signals like the Black Sea Grain Initiative allowing export of Ukrainian and Russian grain and fertilizers through the Black Sea. So there are a number of things. I'm not too hopeless that we cannot come to solutions as discussed today.
And we talk a lot about decoupling and de-risking on China. I'm not sure that distinction is clear in my mind. I'm not sure it's clear in the European policymakers who pronounce it. What we talk less about is détente. What do you think the avenue is for there to be a sort of thawing in the relationship between China and the United States? What is required to try to get past some of these national hurdles in order to get on the same page to deal with a lot of these global crises?
Well, frankly, I am a little bit pessimistic. I always tell people I'm pessimistic, but I'm not passive. I still do my best every day to hopefully contribute a little bit. But when you have the biggest nation in the world want to go a particular direction, it is impossible for any of us to really pull it back, unless you can figure out a way to tell them that your self-best interest is perhaps not what you're doing. And a lot of people know that. But if somebody doesn't want to listen, they don't listen. Today, dialogue is valuable because increasingly there's monologue. And if I engage in monologue, nobody will listen. I'm nobody. But if I am somebody and I have a monologue and my way or highway, then you have the whole world that is affected. I think that, again, major players in the world, such as EU, such as India, such as some of the big groupings, Brazil, from the South America, I think they together is the only hope we have to hold back from the madness of some of the things that I've been watching in my part of the world.
And I think that a lot of people hoped that climate could be this sort of issue where everyone has a stake and that everyone's sort of interests were fundamentally aligned on this. But I think that there has been some disappointment in terms of that really being a guiding light that everyone can agree on. I'll ask you, why do you think that is? And what can we do to reframe this conversation meaningfully, not just sort of abstractly, to get people thinking about this in a collective way? Because, I mean, again, the premise of the sort of globalization age is align everyone's economic interests and everything else will follow. We've learned that that is perhaps not so. So can we do that with climate?
Well, I mean, my own assessment would be that there is an increasing agreement that climate change is, besides next to the debt crisis, the biggest crisis to be tackled. Of course, they play on different time horizons. Yeah? If you think about these two now, debt and climate, but there's very clear agreement on the level of the G7, on the level of the G20 last year as well, within the dialogues that we've had now over the past few months between Think 7, Think 20. So if you look at the COPs of the past few years, there's a clear understanding that joint action has to accelerate. The introduction of the third pillar to the UN climate regime, the loss and damage pillar, is hopeful. It's a sign of, it's a clear statement, and it will not go away. Of course, now the question is about how to finance it. That's clear, and answers have to be provided. Here also, the G7 and G20 can and have to, in my view, play an important role in preparing decisions taken later on also, or preparing for the upcoming COP basically in UAE. This model to sort of use the different platforms worked quite well last year as well. And of course, the Just Energy Transition Partnership Agreement as an instrument that was introduced over the past 2 COPs and accelerated in many ways, discussed and refined through the G7 and G20 discussions, has to actually be put into action. So these 2 areas I would see as 2 areas where there is movement, where the movement is not sufficient yet, but where there is clear sort of tangible action taking place that unites or has the potential to unite behind climate change.
And Andreas, one of these important factors that's just been mentioned is the financing. What still needs to be done on financing for climate in order to get to these necessary aims that we've got for decarbonization?
I think this year can actually, this is a very good question, Oliver, because I think this year can actually be the year of financing, of a refocus in financing. As I said, we have the opportunity of President Macron's conference in June, then followed by the G20 summit in Delhi, and then the SDG summit. I believe we need to get more serious about taking the conversation away just the North has to pay for the South. We need to bring in public, not only public finance, also private finance. We have made proposals together with Indonesia last year on blended finance, on really addressing the bottlenecks, and we're working with India currently on reports addressing the bottlenecks. What makes it so complicated for private finance to leverage what we have in the public finance side? So now I think I'm losing the mic. Maybe. Okay, so this is, I think, a huge opportunity for us. And I mean, this is not new, this conversation. We have been discussing this for a couple of years, but I think it's now really time to attack it. And the last thing, and this is a proposal we made at the OECD, we also need to put an economic lens on what we are doing on carbon mitigation. I think it's very good what we have in terms of agreement. The Paris Agreement is a victory for multilateralism. Whenever I hear that multilateralism crisis, I mean, there are many things which work in multilateralism. And what we are proposing there is to underpin this narrative of the Paris Agreement, to bring countries together. And we just had a first meeting with 100 countries, 600 delegates, to discuss the economic aspects of net zero strategies and policies. What is the economic most efficient way to go down the road on climate? Because not everybody will go with a price on carbon. It's, of course, as an economist, the most efficient way to do so. But we need to kind of have a more honest conversation, who is doing what, and what are the economic effects.
So what would success look like at COP28 this year from a financing standpoint, but also just more broadly, do you think?
I mean, I think first of all, we have, we, the advanced economies, and I mean, I'm not representing Germany, I'm representing the OECD, but there is still this $100 billion commitment where we still fall short. We are tracking at the OECD this commitment, so we need to deliver on that. We need to kind of seriously leverage private capital, bringing in private capital into bankable projects, in the energy partnerships, in the infrastructure projects. So I think we need to be a bit more sophisticated in terms of the strategy than what we had before. And I'm pretty optimistic because talking to Paul Polman or others in the industry, there are people who are kind of really want to push the green agenda, and we need to leverage on that.
And last year at COP, when I was there, the moment of sort of the heightened euphoria was Lula's arrival at the conference, and obviously this was shortly after he'd won the election, which is part of it, but also because there's a view that he will make a meaningful difference in this conversation. And for Brazil, where its economy and environment are perhaps less distant in the minds of people. So I'd be curious to get your perspective on him and his impact on it, but then also what that can teach the world about the economy and the environment and their connection.
Well, what is in Brazil for the recent months with the change in the presidency of Brazil is that this is concrete part of the agenda. As almost all the ministers in Brazil now are dialoguing about green economy, about climate change, and bringing this to the agenda. So this is also an important agenda in the T20 and Think 20, in this important agenda at IPEA. What we've seen, as I will do a comparative with health, is that sometimes what we think as a public policy and as a government is not working for society. So we have to establish concrete dialogues and social participation in this agenda. The government is bringing society to the debate, is bringing this discussion, but you have a lot of challenges. And besides that, for sure, Lula is a leader in this debate in the world, because all the eyes are in Brazil now, in this debate about growing and developing and how to deal with the new model of development that considers the green economy and the climate change. It's part of the agenda, it's part of the global agenda, and I think he will have a lead on this, an important lead of this, and we might help all this debate in Brazil and going through the global solutions and debates about what kind of solution. The financing is also a great challenge for us, how to finance the new development model in Brazil.
Yeah, and obviously with the backdrop of rising interest rates and money becoming more expensive, and obviously the consequences of that, I don't think we've yet fully, absorbed or seen. But obviously in the background of all of these discussions, another question on China and the U.S. trying to take a slightly more optimistic view. As China sort of rises in power and in prominence, obviously part of its agenda is to try to be a sort of force for good, or to try to broker deals, to try to develop. Is there, this will sort of for both of you, is there a possible scenario in which you have sort of two competing superpowers that are both pitching to help develop, and that there's a positive outcome from that? Is that at all something that you think is a silver lining here?
I think there's one area that is very promising, and that is in dealing with the sustainability issue. I know that in the United States, it's the only major society that still has a strong element that denies it. But I think that at least with the Biden administration, that is doing a lot better. But the private sector, even during the Trump administration, the private sector was always taking the lead in sustainable finance and so forth. And I think that that is one area China knows that they have been, for the last 30 years of initial development, they have polluted the globe a lot, just like the West polluted a century or two before. It's their turn, and it was terrible. And they know that for their own good, for the long haul, if their children were to have a future, they better take care of the environment. They better take care of be much more green. So that is an area that I see that all the countries of whatever political ideology can come together. As long as a non-Trump-like person will become the president the next time around, and working with the private sector, which, as I said, is always really a leader in sustainability, that I think there's much opportunity to collaborate. I'm very honored to invite I call him the green finance czar of China here, sitting somewhere here. He's speaking in the next session. And he's co-chairing the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group together with the United States, member of the G20 Working Group. And so think about it. The Chinese guy and the American guy are co-heading a group together. So I think that that is one area. I don't think it will be able to turn the tide as far as the geopolitical, the defense, and that side of things. But at least it is a great place to build relationship on an institution-to-institution basis, government-to-government basis, and people-to-people basis. It's a winner for all.
Yeah, I in many ways agree. I would argue that we are somewhere at a tipping point, one could say. We are in a multipolar world order. That's simply, empirically speaking, a fact, so to say. But the question is it a multipolar world order that sort of falls apart into different orders that compete in a destructive manner or that cooperate. I think climate is an area. We've seen the collaboration in the biodiversity field. Kunming-Montreal agreement is a success on that front. Yeah?
Very good.
And it's in many ways an example that we hope to see also in the field of climate. I would argue in the field of water management, we see similar potentials. And in many ways, I would also like to briefly mention the potential of science and think tank communities to play an important role there as a third player, as an investment into the infrastructures needed, discursive, communicative infrastructures needed to actually have these dialogues.
And then another question for you in terms of climate. And so obviously Germany's been a very sort of vocal voice in the climate discussion. However, it has also been one that has had a sort of carbon explosion over the last 12 months, in part obviously because of what's happened in Ukraine. But it sort of speaks to this idea that when things actually get really hard, that we are not willing to give up certain things. Do you think that that makes it more difficult for Germany to take a leading role? And what does it tell us about kind of our relationship with how to deal with climate?
Well, I think it reminds us of, or urges us to think about something that we might want to call regulated abstinence. That's a direct translation from German. But thinking about, realizing that we need to cut. We need to cut our greenhouse gas emissions. And then still basically using the liberty and making use of the freedom to actually decide ourselves. And that realization, I would say, is slowly coming in. We, in a previous session, discussed the CO2 taxing and the carbon border adjustment mechanism in the European Union, the discussions on it, that are highly controversial. I would argue it's the way to go, but not as it is being implemented right now, which has the disadvantage that it was not designed in the WTO, and with that it did not take into account the effects, the negative effects that it also has on a number of least developed countries and low and middle income economies.
And do you think that we can break that sort of idea of having to sacrifice in order to make climate progress economically? Is that something that you think is, I think it's a very challenging sell because of the way that the world has developed for 100 years. You are dependent on some of these systems. How do you solve that?
Well, I think it's not easy for sure. If it was easy, we would have done it yet. I love this idea of regulate addictiveness.
Regulated abstinence?
Abstinence, yes.
Yeah.
I use this term. Because besides that, if you look at Brazil, we are one of the most unequal countries in the world. We have been trying to do inclusive growth without deploying our natural resources. And what we've seen is that we have a lot of challenges in this path. Economic challenges, social challenges. But I think we have to do a mindset. We have to bring society together. The government has to work for the society, not for itself. The market has to work for the society, not for itself. And then we have to think globally. What is our role in this world? What are we doing for this? What is our contribution for this? Decarbonization, the energy, renewable energy in Brazil are growing, but we have a lot of problems in the environmental side, and we have to talk about this. And I think the T20 and the G20 has really unique space for this debate. I think we should use this to bring this agenda strongly and cooperate with each other in this agenda.
And Andreas, in terms of, again, the global sort of macro picture economically, obviously inflation has been a severe issue globally. Recession now, there's some questions about kind of how that develops. And there is obviously a baseline of economic well-being that is required, that you need in order to achieve any of these sort of lofty goals. What do you think that multilateral institutions now need to do going into this very uncertain period to ensure that, particularly for the nations that are most at risk?
Okay, now he comes with the $100 billion question at the end. Not an easy one. I mean, this morning I started my trip to here in Potsdam, and I have a petrol station vis-a-vis my place, and the liter petrol costs €1.80. So it's something, I mean, maybe not an issue for me, but an issue for many people in Germany or around the world. So we need to kind of get inflation under control. I think the central banks are doing their job there. We need to kind of make sure that we come with a sustainable solution on the debt in many developing and emerging economies. And I think we need to kind of, this should not make us shy away these economic issues that we need to solve this climate picture. And here I wanted to take something up, which was Ronnie spoke about interests. What is the interest of the countries around the table? And I believe really we have here an opportunity, and this brings me to the point where you started it. I don't think that this focus on a bipolar solution or even a multipolar solution will help us. The point is, we have many opportunities, and there are many countries around the table. For example, India is now putting a new Green Development Pact on the agenda of the G20. There is President Lula coming with a new ambitious agenda for the Amazon. There is President Macron, there is Chancellor Scholz with the climate lobby. So everybody around the table has an interest. So you put on the book you're distributing, the Global Solutions Initiative Days, the title is Recoupling, and I would add reconnecting, and I would add refocusing and focusing. Follow the thing where is the interest. And final point, we have some good experience at the OECD, for example, with the taxation agenda, where we started with 35 countries at the OECD, put it for the G20. Now we have 160 in automatic exchange and 140 who are negotiating now a global minimum tax deal for multinationals to make sure that everybody pays a fair share in taxation. So this means that follow the interest. We have an opportunity to really nail down. And this is what multilateralism needs to deliver, refocus and follow the interest.
And on that subject, just as a follow-up, there's this, multilateralism and inclusiveness. Is the G7 an effective forum? Do you think that is something that is helpful in terms of doing that, of bringing people in?
There's a famous German saying, "Totgesagte leben länger," means that people who are said that can live longer. And I started my career 20 years ago organizing my first summit was a G8 summit in St. Petersburg, organizing the G8 summit in Heiligendamm, where we tried to build a dialogue between the G8 and the G5 at that moment in time. Then the financial crisis came, and we were told, forget about it. Russia was kicked out after the invasion of Crimea. Then people were telling us, forget about it, G7. This will no longer be the forum. And today we see that the crisis, the war in Ukraine has brought the G7 even closer together than before. And as we speak, just finished the G7 finance ministers meeting in Niigata in Japan with a very ambitious agenda. And who was there? The finance minister of Brazil, the finance minister of Indonesia, the finance minister of India, the finance minister of the Comoros. So I think the G7 is currently reinventing itself, also kind of reaching out to some countries, considering a like-minded group of countries taking joint action. So I believe that the G7 has kind of reinvented and will continue to be a very effective forum. But this is my final point. I believe we should not forget that at the end of the day, the G20 is the more representative group. And for us, also as OECD, I'm working with more than 100 countries. It's very, very important to really see this challenge together. I don't think that division north-south does help us too much, and we need to listen much more to countries like India, Brazil, South Africa, others around the table, Argentina, and work together on this.
But while it may have brought the G7 closer together, it may not have brought the G7 unit closer to others. So Ronnie, I'll go to you on that.
Yeah, you're right. And Andreas, you scare me. When you say G7 are now closer together, I said, is it necessarily good for the world? In something, yes. But that may also mean, not always, that you have G7 versus the rest. And G7 is very wealthy, small number of people. But what about the rest? So I agree with your last statement that the G20 is far more representative. Let's make sure that as G7 come together, become closer, that it doesn't become exclusive. And exclusivity is not something that you necessarily plan to do. But there's a lot of other thing that other people, how other people perceive you. It is said that it's not what people say, it is what other people hear. So it is not what you do, it is what other people perceive you to be. Both sides are important, obviously. So I think that the G20 is really a wonderful area to bring the world closer together. Can I also add that there are many other areas, Anna Katarina offer a few, such as water and so forth. Can I add one or two others? And that is, even, I know that is sensitive here in Europe, even arts and culture. When you, for whatever reason, such as Ukraine war, cut off a lot of art and cultural exchanges, is it in the longer run good for the international community? I really have my question. And then, moreover, I think the world is changing so fast these days that I offer a thought that you all may kick me out once I finish saying it because it is so radical. I say 5 to 10 years later, who will be the more international of the two major nations, United States or China? I don't think the answer is that obvious. That my worry is that countries such as China, India, and Brazil, some other countries, may become much more internationalist than the traditional economies. Back to the same point about the G7, you can also work yourself out of the center of the internationalization. So I think that, I like the global solutions. We're trying to find solutions. When Dennis Snower told me before he started this thing 7 years ago, he tried to think big and so forth. I said, wonderful. But I think that to think big sometimes is really can be even offensive to some people. And so I think we all need to brace ourselves and entertain ideas that perhaps has not been so for the last 50, 100 years. But maybe tomorrow, and you don't plan for it, then you may be taken by surprise.
Yeah, just to add, I mean, definitely in many, many ways, the music of the future is playing in the G20 and not the G7. But of course, G7 has something to add and is part of the G20. I just want to add what is often missing from these conversations is the G77. And obviously, there's another layer. there's another, layer is not entirely correct, but we should include here also, of course, the G77.
And so, final sort of question on that, maybe to you. What do you hope that the Indian presidency to the G20 will bring to kind of that conversation that might be different than what we've had in the past?
I think that having a presidency that is have the BTTC working together and with the T20, and we're organizing this agenda for the presidency of Brazil will be really important. The transition will be not disruptive. We think that we have to build on amplifying the dialogue, bring more people together. I think G77 is also important to debate with T20, T7, and T77. Thinking more globally will help, and India brought a lot of issues that are thinking more globally for a medium development country and from a different perspective that will be very important for us.
Great. Well, I see the clock is ticking down. I have strict instructions to wrap before the time, so I will do so. And if you could just join me in thanking the panel today. Thank you so much.